Very few people spoke about the SS women. The focus was always on the men, but they were also deeply involved. Many started young in Nazi groups. Others were secretaries, nurses, or guards. Some signed papers that sent people to the trains. Several monitored camps, gave orders, beat people, or managed selection lists. The Third Reich involved them in everything. They were indoctrinated as young women and then sent to camps like Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, or Bergen-Belsen. They had uniforms, salaries, and power over the prisoners. Sometimes they had dogs. Sometimes they carried whips. They decided who stayed alive and who didn't. It wasn't disorder or coincidence. They were organized with names and titles. Some paid with their lives. Others disappeared among the people and were never heard of again. What happened to the women of the Nazi regime when everything collapsed? Behind the smoke, the women of the camps. At the end of 1944, advertisements appeared in German newspapers offering jobs to healthy women between the ages of 20 and 40. They promised good pay, clothing, food, and a bed. What they didn't say was that the uniform was from the SS and that the job was inside camps where torture and death took place. Some applicants didn't know what awaited them. Others did, and still they entered. The guards lived inside the camp, many with children. From their windows they didn't see gardens or streets, but collapsed prisoners and columns of smoke rising from the chimneys. Life there wasn't easy, but for many it was better than assembling parts in a factory. There was housing, salary, and power. Most came from humble homes with little education and were already part of the Nazi youth. They believed they were part of a cause. The uniform gave them authority over the prisoners and over other Germans. Ravensbrück was the starting point. A camp just for women, with more than 120,000 prisoners. Jews, resistors, lesbians, prostitutes, the homeless. 30,000 died there. Some were hanged, others from hunger, infections, or cold. The guards beat, punished, or let them die. The inmates gave them nicknames: the Bitch of Buchenwald, the Angel of Auschwitz. Irma Gräser, blonde and young, ended up hanged after the trial. Her photo became an icon of horror. Of the 3,500 who held those positions, only 77 reached a court. Many were released after a few years. Some, like Ilse Koch, died denying everything. Others, like Herta Botha, never apologized. There are records of women who resigned as soon as they saw what was happening. No one went after them, but many others stayed, out of necessity or conviction. Some passed themselves off as victims. Others were turned into monsters. The majority were ordinary women who crossed a line. Only a few, very few, showed any humanity. A guard with a watch and a rule. The end came when the Soviets were about to enter Ravensbrück. It was just days before liberation, and everyone in the camp knew it. Binz, like many other guards, gathered her things, burned documents, and left. She didn't wait for orders, she just disappeared. It was April 27th, 1945. She blended in with the civilians, left behind her SS uniform, and walked through Hamburg like anyone else. She tried to go unnoticed, but on May 3rd she was caught. The arrest was made by the British Army. She was transferred to a newly set-up prison in Recklinghausen. It was a place that had previously been used as an auxiliary post for Buchenwald. There they put several SS women who had worked with her. They waited for several months until the trial began. It was the first of 7 trials dedicated to that place. Binz's trial began on December 5th, 1946, in Hamburg. She was accused alongside others like Johann Schwarzhuber, Rolf Rosenthal, Greta Bösel, and Gustav Binder. All faced charges for war crimes. The accusation was clear: abuse and murder of Allied prisoners in the camp between 1939 and 1945. During the hearings, Binz didn't deny her role. She admitted to slapping prisoners, to hitting them with a ruler if they responded or didn't accept what was told to them. She said she was just fulfilling her duty to maintain control and discipline. She also admitted to handing dozens of reports against prisoners to her superiors. When her lawyer asked if some inmates were satisfied with that treatment, she said it was better than not eating. The court listened to her for weeks. Witnesses testified, documents were reviewed, and finally the verdict came. On February 3, 1947, Major Westrop read the sentence. Binz was sentenced to the gallows for war crimes. The execution took place in Hamelin. The scheduled time was May 2nd at 9 in the morning. The executioner was a British man who had already hanged several Nazis. Dorothea entered the room, stood on the trap door. They placed the rope around her neck and the hood over her head. The lever was pulled. The fall was instant. Binz died without making a sound. She was only 27 years old. Maria Mandel, the head of the orchestra in Auschwitz. Born in 1912 in a small town in Austria called Münzkirchen, Maria Mandel grew up in a working-class family. Her father earned a living by repairing shoes, and her mother handled things related to blacksmithing. They went to Mass every Sunday. She was the youngest of 4 siblings and was always pampered. At school she was known and liked. She was attractive and had a knack for speaking. She first worked in the postal service but was dismissed for clashing with Nazi ideas. That changed quickly. She became a guard at the Lichtenberg camp. In 1939 she was transferred to Ravensbrück, where she was appointed as the head. There she didn't do office work. She was in charge of punishing prisoners, pushing them to the limit and carrying out beating sessions. Women who couldn't handle the daily checks ended up in the punishment cell. There they were whipped in groups of 25, 50, or even 100. None of them could count to 10 out loud before either fainting or dying. Witnesses said she enjoyed having power. Inmates like Irma Grese, Dorothea Binz, or Juana Bormann followed her example. She set the standard. Under her leadership, beatings became routine. The women were left naked without food, their bodies bruised and thrown into the cold. Nois Catala, who survived there, recalled that sometimes they stood from 4 in the morning until 9, in temperatures as low as 30 degrees below zero. Maria wore light gloves. She liked seeing them stained. She supervised experiments on prisoners. They left permanent damage, made them infertile, broke their bones and sewed them back without anesthesia. They died on the table. Then their bodies were taken to the crematorium. In 1942 she arrived at Auschwitz. There she carried out inspections and decided who stayed alive and who died. To the right, temporary salvation. To the left, extermination. Not even children were spared. Once she took care of a Roma child, but then ordered him to be killed. She created the camp's women's orchestra. They had to play music during selections when prisoners arrived or when someone died. She obsessed over cleanliness, not out of humanity, but to avoid outbreaks. Bodies piled up, and uniforms were given to new inmates. During a winter disinfection, 1,000 women froze to death. Meanwhile, she walked around shooting some. Later, she was sent to Mühldorf, part of the Dachau system. There, she continued with selections and punishments. When the Allies approached in 1945, she fled through the mountains and tried to return to her village. She was arrested on August 10th of that year. The Americans interrogated her, and in 1946 she was handed over to Poland. In November of 1947, she was tried in Krakow. During the trial, testimonies from those who suffered under her command were heard. She didn't admit to anything. She denied having objects of punishment or any decision-making power. She blamed Rudolf Höss. In the courtroom was Bertha Falk, a survivor. Maria said a phrase to minimize her responsibility. On December 22, 1947, she was sentenced to hang. The day before her execution, in the common shower, she crossed paths with Stanisława Rachwałova, a former inmate of Auschwitz. Maria, with tears in her eyes, asked for forgiveness. Stanisława forgave her on behalf of the prisoners. They hugged and said goodbye. It was the last time they saw each other. On December 24, 1947, she was hanged. Before her death, she shouted, "Long live Poland!" Then her body was taken to the Faculty of Medicine in Krakow. Students used it for practice. She was 36 years old, 5 feet 5 inches tall, and weighed 60 kilograms. She had visible marks on her neck. Juana Bormann in the death row corridor. Juana Bormann was born in Birkenfelde, in Thuringia. At her trial, she lied about her age. She claimed to be 42, but she was actually about 10 years older. There are no records of her family or friends. She barely attended school. She had been a missionary before getting involved with the Nazis. Those who knew her before no longer spoke of her. She seemed like an insecure, frustrated woman, with a character that turned violent as soon as she could command others. She worked for a while in a psychiatric hospital, earning little. In 1938, she enlisted as a civilian in the SS and was sent to the Lichtenberg camp, where she earned much more. There, she started as a cook. She later moved to Ravensbrück, and in 1942 she was transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau. There she crossed paths with Irma Grese and Maria Mandel. She shared a taste for violence with Irma. She had dogs trained to attack. The prisoners nicknamed her the Weasel. Testimonies from the 1945 Bergen-Belsen trial left no doubts. Dora Safran recounted how Juana released her German shepherd to bite a prisoner's neck. The prisoner died shortly after. The animals were huge, dark and aggressive. The prisoners would arrive at the infirmary with serious injuries. Dr. Adabimko confirmed this. Allegra Calderon, a 17-year-old Greek prisoner, and Rachela Kelishek, another inmate, shared how the dogs would tear apart entire bodies. Regina, one of them, died from the attacks. Esther Walgruth witnessed something similar. She also spoke of mutilations that ended in death. Several witnesses saw Juana participating in selections alongside Nazi doctors. She decided who would work and who would go to the gas. Some days saw as many as 500 deaths. Her focus was always on the women's block. Dora Silberberg, another witness, testified that Juana punched her, knocking out 2 of her teeth. Then she hit her with a stick. She always carried some kind of object, a club, a rod, whatever she could get her hands on. Alexandra Siwidowa declared that Juana would beat many for wearing too good clothes. She forced them to undress, made them exercise until they could no longer move, and when they couldn't, she beat them with whatever she found. Many died after those beatings. Dr. Ella Lingens-Reiner described her as a bitter woman, devoid of affection for anyone except for her dog. She said that she didn't appeal her sentence because she felt her world had ended with the defeat of the Reich. During her time at Auschwitz and Birkenau, many disappeared due to starvation, diseases, or alleged escape attempts. Sometimes they would make the prisoners run toward the electric fences with the excuse of getting an extra ration. But what awaited them was a bullet. Some SS men did this for fun. After Birkenau, she was sent to Budi, then to Hindenburg, and finally to Bergen-Belsen. There she continued with her punishments. When the British arrived on April 15, 1945, they saw bodies everywhere. The women and children were naked, lying outside. The British forced the Nazi staff to bury the corpses. That's when they caught Juana. The trial began on December 17, 1945. Along with Kramer and 44 others, Juana was accused of crimes against humanity. She was identified for mistreating and murdering prisoners. Initially, all attention was on Irma Gräser, but as the trial progressed, testimonies began to focus on Bormann. They called her the woman with the dogs. She denied everything. She said she only slapped prisoners if they didn't listen to her. She denied having dogs. She claimed she joined the SS only for the salary. It didn't help. She was sentenced to death. On Friday, December 13, 1945, at 10:38 in the morning, she was taken to the scaffold. They covered her head, adjusted the rope and opened the trapdoor. 20 minutes later, the body was still hanging. They put her in a wooden box and buried her in the prison gardens. Pierre Pointe would later say, "She walked trembling, very aged. She was only 42. She said in German, 'I have my feelings.'" A wife among ovens and corpses. Elisabeth Volkenrath was born on September 5, 1919, in a village called Schönau an der Katzbach. She was the 6th daughter of Josef and his wife, who earned a living as forest workers. From the age of 6 to 14, she attended classes in the same town. Then, between 1933 and 1938, she worked various jobs. She cared for children, cut hair, and also served as an assistant in a kitchen. In 1939, she was sent to an arms factory. 2 years later, in 1941, she appeared at the Ravensbrück camp to train as a guard. Years later, during the Bergen-Belsen trial, she said her task was to ensure that the prisoners did their work without attempting to escape. In August of 1941, she was transferred. She was sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau. By March of the following year, she was in charge of the Auschwitz one tailoring shop. She held that position until August of 1942, when she was moved to the women's section of the camp. There, her role included, among other things, distributing bread to the female prisoners. She wasn't there long, as she contracted typhus and spent months hospitalized. Once she recovered, she was given a new position in the Auschwitz-Birkenau post office in December of 1942. In the novel Three Sisters, Tsibi Meller, one of the inmates who worked under her command, recounted that Elizabeth would often allow food packages to be redistributed among those who survived if the intended recipient had already died. Still, Meller made it clear, that woman had as much blood on her hands as anyone in Birkenau. Mella also described an incident when Volkenrath's husband nearly killed her for throwing away a newspaper. Elizabeth intervened to calm the situation, but warned Sibi that if it happened again, she wouldn't get involved. She met Heinz Volkenrath, an SS member within the camp itself. They ended up marrying there with a ceremony and other SS members as escorts. While all of this was happening, the oven in the back was spewing ash. In November of 1944, she was promoted to chief supervisor. From then on, she had a direct role in the selections. She participated in the lines where decisions were made about who would stay alive. On February 5, 1945, she was transferred to Bergen-Belsen. There, she continued the same tasks. Along with Irma Gräser, she forced weak prisoners to hold huge stones above their heads for hours. By that time, Elizabeth was openly stating that Germany had lost and that everyone from the regime would be hanged. After the conflict ended, she faced charges in the Bergen-Belsen trial. She denied everything. The accusations of beatings that left prisoners unconscious or led to death, according to her, were lies. She claimed that if she ever reacted violently, it was with an open hand and only when prisoners broke the rules. Regarding the selections for the gas chambers, she insisted that her job was to control the group and that no one knew what happened afterward. The judges didn't believe her. She was declared guilty. On December 13, 1945, she was hanged by a British executioner. First, she was buried in the Hamelin prison cemetery. In 1954, her remains were transferred to the municipal cemetery of the same city. Braunsteiner, the hunt for the mayor. Hermine Braunsteiner was born on July 16, 1919, in Vienna. Her father was a chauffeur and sometimes a butcher, and her mother cleaned houses. She was the youngest of 7 and was raised with strict religious discipline. She wanted to be a nurse, but she only studied until 8th grade and ended up working in a brewery and as a servant. In 1938, after the annexation of Austria to Germany, she became a citizen of the Reich. She moved to Berlin, worked in an aircraft plant, but the pay was meager. She joined as a camp guard. In 1939, she started training at Ravensbrück. Soon, she was put in charge of prisoners and became known for her brutality. She would kick them until they passed out. None of her colleagues stopped her. She didn't get along with Mandel. Both wanted control of the camp. Mandel won, and Hermine's position was lowered. In October of 1942, she was sent to Majdanek. There she became famous for her kicks. She would hit elderly women, wore steel-toed boots, and had no qualms about killing with blows. She participated in the selections for the gas chambers. She was feared by the inmates, whom she would whip and kick until their faces were deformed. Several witnesses remembered her throwing children into trucks bound directly for the chambers. Some saw her give sweets before leading them to their deaths. Others pointed out that she would beat people to death and punish anyone who tried to stop her. In 1944, when the Soviets were approaching, she was moved back to Ravensbrück. After the war ended, she was arrested by the Americans. She later escaped to Vienna. She was captured again in 1946 and was tried only for crimes committed at Ravensbrück. She was sentenced to 3 years. She was released in 1950. She changed her name, worked in hotels, and in 1958 married an American mechanic. They moved to Queens, New York. In the United States, she lived under a different name. She obtained citizenship in 1963, but Simon Wiesenthal discovered her and alerted immigration. In 1964, the New York Times published her story. She defended herself in the media, saying that she had already paid for her actions and that she had only followed orders. Her husband also excused her. Ultimately, the United States revoked her citizenship for lying on her paperwork. She was extradited to Germany in 1973. She was put in jail, and her trial began in 1975. It lasted until 1981. Several former prisoners testified. She showed no remorse. She was sentenced to 2 life terms. In prison, she spent her time alone, sewing toys. In the 1990s, due to diabetes, she had one of her legs amputated. In 1996, she was released for health reasons. She went to live with her husband in a residence in Bochum. After that, she disappeared. There is no clear date for her death. The Stutthof guard, who was hanged at 24. Jenny Wanda Bachmann, one of the guards at a Nazi camp in Poland, was famous for her pretty face, but more so for the brutality with which she treated the prisoners. She was born on May 30, 1922, in Hamburg. Her childhood was similar to that of any other person before the dictatorship began. When she was almost 11, Hitler came to power. At 16, the pogroms destroyed Jewish homes, businesses and synagogues during Kristallnacht. Shortly after, Germany invaded Poland and the war began. At first, she wanted to be a model because she thought her looks would be enough. But as the war dragged on, she changed her mind. In 1944, at the age of 21, she entered as a guard at Stutthof, a camp near Gdansk. According to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, up to 100,000 people passed through there, and about 60,000 died. Many from disease, but others were taken by the guards to the gas chambers. Bachmann was one of the 3,700 women who worked as guards in the Nazi camps, among more than 50,000 total guards. She quickly gained a reputation as one of the most cruel. She had no problem beating people to death. She often sent women and boys to the gas chambers if they were no longer fit for labor. They called her the Pretty Ghost. While her name echoed throughout Stutthof, the war was nearing its end. In April of 1945, Hitler shot himself. The following month, Germany signed its surrender. Bachmann fled the camp and was searched for everywhere. She managed to hide for 4 months until she was caught at a station in Gdansk. When she was interrogated, she claimed that she had treated the Jews well and even helped some. But many survivors pointed her out with details during the trial. Her lawyer admitted she was guilty, but said she must have been crazy to do what she did. According to him, no one in their right mind could have done such things. She didn't attempt to justify herself. She only smiled with contempt every time they talked about what she had done. She showed no remorse and never apologized. When they told her she would be hanged, she said, "Life is a great joy, but joy doesn't last." On July 4, 1946, she was taken with other war criminals to Biskup Hill, near Gdansk, where they were executed in front of a crowd. It is said that more than 200,000 people came to watch. She was killed at the age of 24. After that, the authorities decided they would no longer carry out public executions, beatings, sweets and gas, the story of Hildegard. She was known for beating children senseless. Hildegard Lecher, nicknamed the Tigress. Some called her Brigida the Bloodthirsty, tall, with a strong build, and so imposing that people would look down when she passed. Those who crossed her path said her face would change when she hit someone, as if she were a different person. She was first at Majdanek, then at Auschwitz. After leaving, she ended up spying for the CIA. She was born on January 20th, 1920, in Berlin. When the extermination began, she worked as a nurse. She wasn't a member of the Nazi Party, but volunteered at Majdanek. That's where she earned her reputation. Later, at Auschwitz, she kept her nickname. She left before the Russians arrived in '44. With the SS and her colleagues, she seemed friendly. But to the prisoners, she was ruthless. Savage beatings, her face distorted with hatred as she unleashed her wrath. She liked to torment Jewish women. Her companion, Christa Roy, said she loved using the whip. She had children, but that didn't stop her. She beat pregnant women and killed children. At Majdanek, she led children to their death. First, she would give them sweets to gain their trust, then load them onto trucks bound for the chambers. Almost ready to leave, she became pregnant. She had her third child and was then sent to Auschwitz. She stayed there until December of '44. She left when the Soviets were getting close. On November 24, 1947, she was tried along with 23 former SS members in the Auschwitz trial. She was sentenced to 15 years. She was imprisoned in Krakow. She was released after serving only 9 years in 1956. Then she disappeared for a while, but her story did not. In 1975, she was tried again in Germany. The trial was long, lasting until June of '81. The Düsseldorf court added 12 more years to her sentence. During this trial, the victims recounted everything again, exact details of the beatings and the tortures. Still, she was released before finishing her sentence. Later, according to Der Spiegel, she worked as a spy for both the United States and West Germany. She conducted operations against the Soviets. Not only did they recruit former Nazi men, but also women like her. She died a free woman in 1995 at the age of 75. 30 a day, the routine of Irma-Grass. One of the most well-known guards did not fit the stereotype of a burly, coarse woman. She was a young woman with striking looks, combining her beauty with a chilling brutality. Her name was Irma Grese, and she was born in 1923. Her family was completely broken. At 15, she dropped out of school 2 years after her mother took her own life. From then on, she moved from one job to another, first milking cows, then working on a farm, and later at a medical center where she attempted to train as a nurse, though she didn't complete the training. She then worked cleaning in a clinic in Hohenleichen, where she met Dr. Karl Gebhardt, who would later be tried for conducting surgical experiments on inmates at Ravensbrück and Auschwitz. Gebhardt held some affection for her and tried to encourage her to move forward. Irma knew she had a face that stood out, blonde, with very light eyes and a soft smile. But behind that face was something cold, something dark. Some saw her as an actress. She groomed herself meticulously, accumulating luxury dresses from expensive stores in cities like Paris, Vienna, Amsterdam, and Bucharest. Even the regime officials would stare at her for long periods. In March of 1942, at just 18 years old, she was accepted as a volunteer at the women's camp in Ravensbrück. That place became her new base of operations. There she learned how everything worked. She was assigned office tasks, but also witnessed the actions of the other guards. This site served to train future female guards. From there came others as ruthless as Ilse Koch or Dorothea Binz. After this period, in March of the following year, she was sent to Auschwitz. Upon arrival, she was given tasks such as handling correspondence, managing warehouses, and overseeing work crews. She wasn't even 20, and she was already rising through the ranks. In the fall of 1943, she was promoted and became the second most powerful woman in the camp, just below Maria Mandel. From then on, she had direct control over about 30,000 prisoners, many of whom were Jewish, Polish, and Hungarian. One of her tasks was deciding who would go to the gas chambers. During her trial, she said she only heard about it from the prisoners, that all she did was order them to line up in groups of 5, and then Mengele would arrive to make the selections. But the testimonies of those who survived told a very different story. They said she would walk through the barracks wearing a pressed uniform, clean boots, a whip at her belt, and large dogs that she used as punishment. Sometimes she would let them loose on women to attack them. She also shot people in cold blood. She would whip prisoners with a leather whip, especially on their chest if they were deemed pretty. One prisoner said she knocked the breath out of her with blows and then sat on her until she stopped breathing. No one could attract attention more than she could. Speaking among prisoners could be costly. It was said that once she gouged a girl's eyes out for talking to a boy through the fence. Sexual abuse and violence against minors were part of her daily routine. There is no exact number of how many victims she caused, but some records say that on certain days she killed 30 people in a single barrack. In total, it could be more than 30,000. She didn't just stay at Auschwitz. Between January and March of 1945, she briefly returned to Ravensbrück, and then was sent to Bergen-Belsen. During the night of the surrender, from April 14th to 15th, Commander Joseph Kramer was negotiating with the British. Meanwhile, the remaining guards kept shooting those who tried to escape. When the British soldiers entered at dawn, they found all the staff impeccably dressed. Among them was her. Inside the camp, they were met with bodies everywhere, disease, madness, and hunger. There was no way to describe what they saw. In the barracks, the corpses were stacked. Many had fled the day before, but about 80 stayed behind to help the Allies. On April 17th in the morning, they photographed Gress still at the site next to Kramer. Though she no longer looked the same, she still held a certain air of superiority. She was arrested, tried along with 40 other officers, and accused of murder and inhuman treatment at Belsen and Auschwitz. In her room they found objects that included manipulated human remains as trophies. She herself had killed and skinned 3 prisoners. During the trial, she never acknowledged anything. She even sang SS songs the night before being hanged. The court found her guilty and sentenced her to death by hanging. She was 22 years old. Before she died, she only asked for one thing: make it quick. When death marched on foot, Hertha and the routes of no return. Many of the women who became guards seemed to feel important in that role, and a clear example of that was the one known as the sadist of Stutthof. Hertha Botter had been a nurse before joining the Nazi apparatus, and she passed through the camps of Ravensbrück, Stutthof, and Bergen-Belsen. She would move through the barracks, shouting like a madwoman, scaring the prisoners and hitting those who, according to her, didn't wash dishes properly or didn't make the beds right. She loved sowing fear. Unlike other guards who barely knew how to read, she had more experience. She had started working very young and always had a knack for getting people to like her. In 1938, at just 17 years old, she would help her father in the family sawmill, make rounds at factories, and care for the sick in a workers' hospital. At that time, people in her town would say she was a model of good conduct, but that didn't last long. A year later, in 1939, she joined the German Women's League, a women's group from the Nazi Party that fascinated her. For 3 years she excelled in physical activities, and her superiors were so pleased that in September of 1942 she was sent as a guard to the Ravensbrück camp. She spent a month training to integrate into the staff there, where she met Irma Gräser and Dorothea Binz, with whom she would later share all kinds of atrocities. After those 4 weeks, her path as a guard began at her first assigned location, the Stutthof camp. Initially controlled by the Gestapo as a site for civilian internment, it became an official concentration camp in January of '42. It was located in a swampy, forested area near a small town of the same name. Over 80,000 people died there out of the 110,000 who passed through its gates. It wasn't just from hunger or plague, but also from the daily killings carried out by the guards. Starting in '43, the site was included in the mass extermination plan. The overcrowding was so severe that new arrivals were sent directly to the gas chambers as soon as they entered the camp. Alongside this, the abuses suffered by prisoners at the hands of the guards made the stay a certain death sentence. Herta was one of the 130 women who worked there during its worst time. 34 of them, including her, were later accused of committing atrocities. After the war, a number of survivors gave testimony about how she would beat, shout, deprive food and shoot without hesitation. She would take away rations or anything useful purely as punishment, and every time she appeared in the barracks, she did so to sow terror. On January 21, 1945, at just 24 years old, Herta had already earned a promotion. She was tasked with one of the heaviest duties, escorting groups of prisoners walking from central Poland to what is now Lower Saxony. These transfers, known as death marches, were done on foot along endless routes. The journey between the two camps surpassed 700 kilometers, and there was no break or transportation. During that walk, those who lagged behind fell, exhausted from hunger or fatigue. Along the entire route, the treatment was brutal. The guards would push them, insult them, and often leave them lying motionless. To make matters worse, they were forced to take a detour, as on the route to Bergen-Belsen, they were made to divert around 600 more kilometers to camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau. By then, their bodies were already beyond their limits. When they finally reached Bergen-Belsen, they had been walking for 30 days. After that nightmare, Botha returned to Stutthof just before the place was liberated by the British on May 9, 1945. What the troops found was devastating. Over 10,000 bodies were piled up outdoors. There was nothing left to be done for the living because their condition was terminal. The soldiers forced the guards to dig and bury the dead. Botha had to do the same, and the only thing she said about it was her fear of typhus. According to her, the worst part was touching Jewish corpses without protection and having to take breaks constantly to avoid getting infected. When the war ended, they quickly went looking for her. The testimonies against her were direct. Many said they saw her shoot prisoners in cold blood. Other inmates recounted how she would leave those who didn't follow instructions without food or drink. Visits to the barracks weren't checks, they were assaults. Herta didn't talk. She shouted, hit, and forced prisoners to sleep on their own vomit if they threw up from exhaustion. In the trials, 34 women were accused for their actions at Stutthof, among them Botha. During the trial, some survivors detailed how they had seen her kill with a gun in hand. One prisoner recounted that her companion collapsed from exhaustion and Herta shot her without hesitation. Another said she made them dig knowing they couldn't even stand. Those who fell were left in the mud. She was sentenced, but not to death. She received a 10-year sentence. She was sent to a British prison in Germany and was released in 1951 after only 6 years in captivity. After that, she lived in a small town. In an interview, she said she never understood why she was judged. That during the trials, they made her speak without rest, and that the hardest part was having to move bodies without gloves. Ilse Koch, the Witch of Buchenwald. Ilse Koch was born in 1906 in Dresden. After the First World War, she started working wherever she could find a job, like most people in Germany during the economic chaos. She worked in factories and stores until, in 1932, she joined the Nazi Party. This decision gave her an advantage when her allies took control. They found her a position in the office at Sachsenhausen camp. Heinrich Himmler saw her and thought she would be a good match for the camp's commander, Karl Otto Koch. He suggested they pair up, and they did. They married, and she became Ilse Koch, the woman in charge alongside her husband. Karl Otto was ambitious and had no limits. As the Nazis gained power, his career rose. When he was sent to direct Buchenwald, he shaped the camp to his liking. There, more than 200,000 prisoners were imprisoned. A quarter of them died. There were no gas chambers, but there was hunger, epidemics, beatings, and all kinds of abuse. The Kochs lived in luxury. They built an extravagant house with furniture and art that had been stolen. They even created a zoo within the camp, with animals brought from all over the world. She was not a passive wife. She walked around the camp as if it were hers, giving orders and being feared. Her red hair and strong character were intimidating. Witnesses said she had a constant sexual obsession. According to reports, she organized orgies at her house with soldiers, neighbors, and the wives of officers. She also forced prisoners to sleep with her. If anyone didn't please her, they were humiliated or beaten. No one could hold her gaze. If someone did, they ended up dead. In other cases, she would undress or touch them herself. If they didn't react, they were punished. She was called the Bitch of Buchenwald, or the Red-Haired Witch. She herself abused and beat the prisoners when they didn't do what she wanted. She carried a sharp cane. One of her amusements was unleashing furious dogs among the prisoners to watch them attack while she laughed. But that wasn't the most macabre thing. Several people testified that Ilse ordered the execution of prisoners with notable tattoos to keep their skin. One of her lovers, a doctor at the camp, collaborated in this. They would make the new arrivals strip, and if they saw something unusual on their bodies, they were taken out of the line and immediately killed. In the camp, they found treated human remains used to preserve the skin, upholstered items and museum pieces, although it couldn't be confirmed who they belonged to. She was never directly charged with that crime. However, the power and extravagance of the Kochs caught attention, even within the regime. Some officers complained about the ostentation of their lives. 2 doctors at the camp died, which initiated an investigation. Karl Otto claimed they were spies who tried to escape. However, it was discovered that he was being treated for a venereal disease, and he killed them to prevent them from exposing him. The regime transferred him, first to Berlin, then back to Buchenwald. He continued as before. Himmler visited him and found that they were living in luxury during the war. This was enough for them to be accused of corruption and other crimes. Karl Otto was sentenced to death and executed in the camp in April of 1945, just before the Allies arrived. Ilse, however, escaped to West Berlin and hid from the Soviets. When she was caught, she had much to answer for. She was tried in Dachau alongside other women. She was given a life sentence. She avoided the gallows because she was pregnant. No one knew who the father was. It was thought she used this to avoid the death penalty. When the baby was born, it was given up for adoption. Later, an American general reduced her sentence to 4 years. In 1951, she was arrested again and put on trial, this time for crimes against Germans. The trial attracted attention. The story of a woman with power in a camp, her perversions and the subject of human skin filled the headlines. Someone said she was responsible for 5,000 of the 56,000 deaths at Buchenwald. The camp doctors were obsessed with skin. She encouraged them to continue with these experiments. They would remove the skin from bodies, treat it with chemicals, and hang it in the sun. A Czech doctor said that while walking through the camp, he saw these remains spread out. With them, they made gloves, wallets, lampshades, or book covers. The skins with tattoos were the most coveted. Since they couldn't be German, the victims were Soviet, Polish, or Roma. Moreover, they didn't work if the body was too decayed. This is why they sometimes ordered the execution of new prisoners, so that the skin would be in good condition. During the trial, Ilse had hysterical fits. She screamed, fainted, or said things like, "I am guilty," or "I am a sinner." The court decided to leave her in her cell to avoid delaying the process. In the end, she was sentenced to life imprisonment. Inside the prison, she was treated badly. The other prisoners despised her. Over time, she began to lose her mind. She screamed day and night. She said that a group of survivors wanted to kill her. This idea took hold of her. Years later, in 1961, she wrote a letter to her son saying she didn't regret anything. She tied sheets to a lamp and hanged herself. She left a note. "I have no other way out. Death is the only way to end this." Johanna Langerfeld, the guard who escaped with help from her prisoners. To close this case, here's an uncommon story, that of a supervisor whom several Ravensbrück inmates came to respect and, according to later reports, even helped escape after the war. Her name was Johanna Langerfeld. She was born in Essen in 1906. She grew up in a religious environment with nationalist ideas. In 1924, she moved to Mülheim, married Wilhelm Langerfeld, but 2 years later, he died from a respiratory illness. In 1928, she had a child with another man and moved to Düsseldorf, where she gave birth. She didn't have a steady job until she was 34. It was then that she began teaching domestic tasks at a commercial centre in Neuss. Since 1935, she worked in a reform school where prostitutes, women without resources, and people considered problematic were imprisoned. Many of them were then sent to camps. In 1937, she joined the Nazi Party, and the following year she became a guard at the women's camp in Lichtenberg. She quickly rose through the ranks. In May of 1939, she was sent to Ravensbrück as a supervisor. There, she controlled the lists for the 14 F-13 program, which selected the weakest prisoners to be eliminated before the mass killings. It was there that she showed a different behavior from the other guards. According to Josefina Bengel, a Polish inmate, Johanna would tear up reports that could condemn prisoners, opposed certain punishments, spoke softly, and listened. She didn't shout or impose violence. On March 18, 1943, a group of 8 condemned women shouted, "Long live Poland!" before being executed by firing squad. A fierce retaliation was expected, but nothing happened. Later, it was revealed that Langerfeld intervened and requested that they only be left standing for 24 hours. For the types of punishments administered there, that was insignificant. In March of 42, she was sent to the female section of Auschwitz. Her job was to decide who would work and who would go to the gas chambers. Rudolf Höss, the camp commander, believed she couldn't handle the task. Nonetheless, Himmler insisted that she be in charge and that no men should enter that section. On July 18th, during a visit from Himmler, Johanna tried to convince him to change the order. She didn't succeed. That same month, the female section was transferred to Birkenau, about 3 kilometers away. Weeks later, Johanna had knee surgery at an SS clinic. During her recovery, she asked to return to Ravensbrück. She wanted to distance herself from Auschwitz. Upon returning, she became even more moderate. Margarete Buber-Neumann, a communist inmate who later became her assistant, said that she was removed for having too much sympathy for the Polish prisoners. She was arrested in Breslau, her son was taken from her, and she was being prepared for an internal SS trial. The fall of the regime halted that process. In December of 1945, she was captured by American troops. In September of 1946, she was handed over to Poland, where she was to be tried for her role in Auschwitz. On December 23rd of that year, she was sent to clean houses designated for prison officials. She never returned. She escaped. Later, it was known that several former inmates helped her. Johanna Moskowska-Penson, who had been imprisoned at Ravensbrück, claimed that only former prisoners could have facilitated her escape. Some women from Krakow knew how to move, whom to bribe, and what to say. Apparently, they succeeded. Langerfeld hid for a time in a convent and then worked as a domestic servant in a private home. In 1957, she returned to Munich illegally. She settled with her sister and lived there for the rest of her life. She died at 73, free. She was one of the few figures from the regime that some prisoners remembered with respect for concrete gestures that they hadn't forgotten. When it was known that she had returned to Germany, no one came after her. There were no orders against her, no legal proceedings, no surveillance. She lived under her real name, without hiding. She was never interned, moved, or investigated again. No authority requested further information about her whereabouts. No new complaints were filed. The years passed without her case being reopened. She died in the same house she had lived in since her return, without ever being summoned, interrogated, or tried again. Her death was quiet, with no official follow-up, no media presence. There were no tributes, protests, or reports. No prosecutor, either in Germany or Poland, requested that her case be reopened. She ended her days off the radar. No pending convictions, no more questions, no more answers. They all passed through the same camps, but they didn't end up the same. Some were hanged, others lived for decades as if nothing had happened. Several wore uniforms, held ranks, and had command. They didn't watch from afar, they were deeply involved. They signed orders, checked lists, led people to the gas chambers or forced labor. Some were judged, others were never called. Several cried in front of the court, others remained silent. Many said they were just following orders. But there are files, photos, names, and stories. There was no uniform punishment. Some paid dearly, others were free in just a few years. The Nazi leaders were relentlessly hunted. Many of them, however, were not. Some lived peacefully, without media attention, without trials, without anything. They died in their homes, without anyone knocking on their door. And it wasn't because it wasn't known, but because no one wanted to look. They were there, they were part of it. What they did doesn't disappear just because there was no conviction.